The world that we understand is artificial. At the end of World War II, the Americans drew their allies together and said that we will patrol the global oceans for everyone, so that anyone can go anywhere at any time, buy any product, participate in any supply chain, and basically exist without need of a military escort. We just have one condition: you have to be on our side versus the Soviets. We created what we now understand as globalization and free trade to fight the Cold War. It was a bribe. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and we have been edging away from that ever since. It's not a Trump thing, it's not a Biden thing, it's not a Clinton thing, it's not a W. Bush thing. It's an American thing. And we are past the point of no return. Now let's assume for the moment that you like globalization, that you want it to continue. Well, the question is then, what does the United States need to do if it wants to keep this system running? Well, I would argue that we need three things. First, we need global interests. We don't have that. The United States is the least involved economy in the world. As a percentage of GDP, we're just not there. In fact, if you factor out Canada and Mexico, we're half of what this even suggests. Who wants to be in the Middle East so the Chinese can import Middle Eastern crude? Just to kind of give you an example, it's not a popular sell. So economically, there's no argument to be made here. What about strategically? Well, the second thing that you need if you want to maintain a global system is you need boots on the ground. You have to keep everybody on the same side. You have to patrol the oceans. You have to keep countries from fighting. We don't have that anymore. This is total American troops stationed overseas since World War II. It's been trending down for decades. In fact, we now have fewer than 10,000 troops in the entirety of the Middle East. That number will probably hit zero this year. It's not that we've decided to leave. It's that we've already left. And what's left of globalization is simply running on inertia. What about the third thing? Well, global engagement requires a political system at home that has bipartisan agreement on America's role in the world. And while I personally would argue that that disappeared years ago, I think in the aftermath of January 6th, we all agree that we need a little bit of political retinkering here before we have any sort of big global plans. Now, let's assume for the moment that Biden is the guy, that he's the person who can bring us all back together, sing on the same page, read from the same page, put together a global plan that we can then go out and re-engage the planet. How long do you think it's going to take him? A month? His whole term? More time than he has left? Folks, this is a decade transition sort of stuff, and we haven't even started that process. So the United States, regardless of intent, is utterly incapable of preserving a global norm. That's the strategic side. That's the political side. Let's talk about the numbers. Let's talk about the economic side. Let's talk about demographics. What we've got here is a standard demographic profile. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Now, when we look at something like Mexico, American business leaders and American political leaders really like what they see, because whenever there's a bulge in the population structure, roughly below age 40, it's all about the spending on kids, on cars, on college, on homes. This is what drives most modern economies, the economic activity of the young. Now, this also is very complementary to the American political system and the American economic system. I mean, just think about the mechanics of this. When you're under 40, you're relatively new at your job. Your value add is not very high. Well, that means that the Mexicans are good at low and mid-scale manufacturing and assembly. That's not what the American workforce does. We do the high end. We do the design. So the propensity for integration between those two systems is massive. In addition, all those young Mexicans buy a lot of products. Most of those products come from the United States. Mexico became our top trading partner in calendar year 2019. They're kind of duking out with the Canadians and the Chinese to maintain that position, but I have no doubt for the rest of our lives, the Mexicans are going to be at the top. This is a partner. This is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago, and they never recovered. Now, they've got a lot of workers who are above age 40, in fact, in their late 50s, early 60s, folks who have been doing what they do literally for decades, very experienced, very high value added, going head to head with the American worker. We will never have a trade surplus with a country like Korea because there just aren't enough young Koreans to purchase the stuff that their workforce produces. It has to be exported, and a lot comes here. Now, from roughly 1980 to 2015, the world was at this wonderful demographic moment. All of the world's economies were either consumption-led like Mexico today, or export-led like Korea today. And because the United States was holding the ceiling up and allowing global trade to flourish, we had the biggest economic boom in the history of our species. GDP, personal growth, trade levels, all of them grew at record levels for 35 years straight. And everything was more or less in perfect balance. This is the ultra-globalized world that we all know. But it was just a moment in time. Here we've got a number of the major economies back in the year 2000. Looks great, right? But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. The global demographic of high consumption was already ending on its own. And the export-led economies, they're all aging into mass retirement. The worst among them is China. Between the one-child policy and rapid urbanization, the Chinese population is in a state of collapse. They're now the fastest aging society in the world. And by 2100, there will be less than half as many Chinese as there are today, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Now, here in the United States, we are a partial exemption to this. Our population structure isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than everybody else's. And it's largely better because of this specific generation, the baby boomers. Now, in some ways, America's baby boomers are just like everybody else's, and almost every country in the world has a baby boomer cadre for the same reasons. World War II ended, the soldiers came home, they got on with their lives, and they had a lot of kids at the same time that cities really got big with suburbs. In that, the boomers do not stand out. Also, the boomers are aging into mass retirement on the same schedule as everybody else, and that's changing the capital structure. So think about how you invest your money personally. When you're 35, you put a very small sliver of a small income away for the future. When you're 55, it's a big fat wedge of a much larger income. And when you're 64 3/4, every dime you can spare, you put into your retirement account. As you age, the velocity of money increases, the volume of money increases, everything that you contribute to the system increases. But then the day after you retire, you never add to it again. In fact, you liquidate your stocks and your bonds and you put it into things like T-bills and cash because you can't take the volatility. So we get this accelerating, steepening curve of capital availability, and then it just falls off a cliff. Writ large, the baby boomers globally retire next year. We're only a year away now. That cliff is just in front of us. Now, in all of that, the baby boomers are the same. American boomers, Canadian boomers, German boomers, Japanese boomers, they all pretty much retire at the same time because they were all born at the same time. But our boomers, America's boomers, did one thing different. They had kids. And say what you will about the American millennial generation, and there's so much we can say about the American millennial generation. They've got one thing going for them that most of their cohorts around the world don't. They exist, and they're providing consumption to the system now, and they will be providing investment in the future.